during the First World War there was rampant xenophobia. Anybody with a German name, or even looked German, was considered to be a spy. So you get some quite ludicrous episodes, such as a chap taking out his old mother in a bath chair, who happens to mention to somebody that, oh, that chap over there looks like a shifty German. And somehow it's the chap's mother that gets translated by word on the street into this shifty German, so the police arrest her. A lot of panic, a lot of xenophobia, and I think that's an interesting sidelight. You'll get people changing their names. If they have German names, they'll anglicise them. We had one particular chap in the Bedfordshire Regiment whose name was Kuhn, K-U-H-N. His parents changed it to Keen during the course of the war because of the xenophobia against the Germans. It will be interesting to see if that's maintained throughout the war, or whether that's only a function really of 1914 and the beginning of the whole process. I always remember a friend of mine talking about, this is Somerset rather than Bedfordshire, but she could remember as a very young girl seeing what she thought was smoke on this lovely summer's day, getting nearer and nearer. And she finally realised it was dust, and it was the dust brought up by thousands of men on the march from one particular place to another. So you'd see quite a lot of troop movements going on. As soon as war broke out, in Bedford in particular, you had the men of the Territorial Army coming in from all over the county, so from Luton, from Dunstable, Leighton Buzzard, Biggleswade, Ampthill and so on, all coming into Bedford by train to march from the station to their various billets. A lot of them were billeted at Goldington Road schools. So you'd see up to 1,000 men marching along, going off to their billets. In Bedford again in particular there was quite a culture shock, because Bedford was the wartime base for the 51st Highland Division. So suddenly you got all these chaps walking about in kilts, talking in broad Scottish accents, which a lot of people of course would not understand. So that was quite a culture shock for the locals. It was also, sadly, a shock for the Highland troops themselves, because a lot of these men came from quite remote areas of Scotland and had not had a lot of the childhood diseases which were considered normal, measles, mumps, scarlet fever and so on. And sadly a lot of these men had no real immunity to these diseases. They'd not been inoculated against them, of course. And quite large numbers got ill quite quickly with these diseases, and some died. You had another case of some Scottish soldiers, drinking rather too much in a pub and stabbing one of their fellows to death in an argument. So there would have been some quite different cultures, really, for the first time coming into this little provincial town. This was something reflected in the rest of the county. The 21st Division, which was comprised largely of troops from the English Midlands and the North, was billeted in and around Leighton Buzzard. 46th North Midland Division, men from Nottinghamshire, Leicestershire, Lincolnshire, was billeted in Luton. So you get quite large numbers of men from other parts of the country coming into the county, bringing different ideas, different dialects, different ways of doing things with them. I think too you would have seen, if you could go back, you would be quite struck by the difference in class, if you like. We were still in a largely Victorian society where the working classes were expected to show deference to their betters, and people in a responsible social position were used to speak in their mind quite openly. I'm thinking here of the Mayor of Luton, who in September held a meeting in the middle of Luton, round the Corn Exchange in what's today George Street, trying to get Luton men to join the colours. He started off by saying that he'd seen a few days before some very smartly dressed men out marching, was very surprised to find that these men came from Luton. As if the stereotype is that the men from Luton were all scruffy and slouched around and were good for nothing. He got some men from the 46th North Midland Division to address the people in Luton, basically saying, well, I know back home in Leicester, 2,500 men have joined up. You good for nothings around here, you need to get on with it and join up instead of being idle and shiftless and skulking about was the phrase that was used, skulking about. Can you imagine what people might have thought listening to that? And these days they would be pretty cross pretty quickly, I think, but the crowd seemed to have just taken it on board and, oh yes sir, yes sir, and gone away and joined up. But I think that was the start of a little bit of simmering resentment in Luton, which showed itself very clearly in the summer of 1919, when the same people that had been criticising them for not joining up and describing them as skulking about decided to organise the Peace Day celebrations in such a way that really the role of the veterans was, they felt, marginalised. This led to a riot and it led to the town hall being burned down. So you're seeing there a very big change from 1914 to 1919. A crowd that will be quite docile in 1914 will not have it in 1919. They've been through the war, they've been through the trenches, and they will not be spoken to and treated as children. So, yes, there's some very interesting social changes, I think. An infantry regiment in 1914 had 3 battalions. And these battalions were roughly 1,000 men each. That was their nominal strength. 2 of these were front-line battalions, and one of them, the 1st battalion, was in Ireland when the war broke out. The other was in South Africa, just outside Pretoria. The 3rd battalion was what was called the Depot Battalion, and that was the battalion that trained the soldiers that would go into the other 2 battalions. That was the normal peacetime establishment. During the war, the number of battalions created mushroomed. There were a number of battalions called service battalions who were set up just to serve for the duration of the war, after which it was intended they would be disbanded. 3 of these from the Bedfordshire Regiment served overseas. The 6th, 7th and 8th battalions, they all served on the Western Front. And it was the men at Ampthill Park, being trained there, that would go into these service battalions, the 6th, 7th and 8th. After a certain time, when those battalions had been trained and were off at the front, the camp changed in nature. It then changed to be a camp where soldiers who from anywhere in England who had been wounded, brought home to convalesce, after they'd recovered, were sent to the camp to be quickly retrained and then sent back out to France to whatever unit happened to need them at the time. So a man, for example, from who had served in the South Staffordshires, who was perhaps from Stafford or vicinity, would come home wounded, get well, and he'd be sent out and he'd find himself in the Bedfordshire Regiment, because that regiment had just suffered casualties in a battle and needed men quickly. So that's why, if people do in their family tree find that their ancestor served in 2, 3 or 4 different units, that's usually the reason why, that they were wounded, came home and then went out to another unit as needed.
Oh, James.